You know, they say television was always supposed to make you comfortable. Soft lighting, warm living rooms, laugh tracks telling you when to chuckle, and problems that got solved in 22 minutes with a lesson and a group hug. The whole promise of the American family sitcom was warmth. Everybody agrees, everybody grows, everybody learns something gentle before the credits roll. Maybe dad learned to listen more. Maybe the kids learned that honesty is important. Maybe Grandma learned that her old-fashioned ways were a little outdated. Bless her heart. That was the formula. That was the deal. But every now and then, a show came crashing through the screen, so loud, so completely unapologetic, and so utterly done with being polite that it did not just break the deal. It walked through your front door uninvited, sat down in the best chair in the whole house, put its feet up on the coffee table, and started saying things that made your grandmother drop her knitting and grab the armrest. Today, we are counting down 12 crazy facts you never knew about All in the Family, the show that did not just change television. It grabbed television by both lapels, shook it until things fell out of its pockets, and forced an entire country to sit down and have a conversation it had been quietly avoiding for decades. And some of these facts are going to genuinely surprise you. A few of them will completely reframe what you thought you knew about this show. At least one of them involves a toilet, which, as it turns out, is a far more historically significant piece of audio than it has any right to be. And there is one fact at the very end of this list that I promise is going to stay with you. It got me when I first found it, and I have a feeling it is going to get you, too. You have been warned. Let us get into it. Number 12. All in the Family premiered on January 12, 1971 on CBS. It ran for 9 seasons through 1979. It was set in a working-class row house in the Astoria neighborhood of Queens, New York, and it followed the Bunker family, Archie, his wife Edith, his daughter Gloria, and his son-in-law Mike, through the loudest, most uncomfortable, most strangely affectionate family arguments ever committed to American television. On caper, that sounds like 100 other sitcoms. Here is what does not sound like 100 other sitcoms. All in the Family was rejected, not once, but twice by the same major television network before it ever found a home. ABC, the American Broadcasting Company, saw the pilot for this show in 1968, watched the whole thing, and decided, with great confidence, absolutely not. They genuinely believed the show would cause civil unrest, real unrest. They pictured riots in the streets over a sitcom. Network executives sat in a room and concluded that putting this program on American television was the kind of decision that could end careers, invite congressional investigations, and possibly bring about some version of the apocalypse. And here's the thing. From where they were sitting in 1968, you could almost understand the panic. American television in the late 60s was a very specific and very carefully managed universe. The big shows of that era were The Brady Bunch, Gilligan's Island, Bewitched, a show about a witch who sneezed and things went sideways. The biggest crisis on television was whether Bobby Brady could make the football team. These were programs engineered from the ground up to offend nobody, challenge nothing, and leave the viewer exactly as comfortable as they were before they sat down. Then along comes this pilot featuring a loud, opinionated, bigoted working-class man from Queens who says things on camera that polite American television had decided, firmly, collectively, and with great certainty, no one was allowed to say on camera. Racial slurs, ethnic jokes, arguments about politics and religion and the marriage bed, things that made network standards committees reach for their blood pressure medication. ABC passed. Twice. The second time they passed, they reportedly suggested Norman Lear make Archie a nicer person, which rather misses the entire point in a way that is almost impressively complete. Sigh. Norman Lear brought the show to CBS. CBS said yes. All in the Family went on to become the #1 show in America for 5 consecutive years. It won 4 consecutive Emmy Awards. It changed the entire landscape of what television was allowed to say and do. ABC passed on that.
There is a lesson in there somewhere. I will let you find it yourself.
Number 11. Here is a fact that most American viewers of All in the Family never knew, and that British viewers have been quietly smug about through 50 years. The show was not an original idea. All in the Family was directly adapted from a British sitcom called Till Death Do Us Part, which had been running on the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, since 1965. The British version was created by writer Johnny Speight and starred Warren Mitchell as Alf Garnett, a loud, opinionated, fiercely bigoted working-class man from East London who spent most of each episode arguing furiously with his patient wife and his left-leaning son-in-law. If that character description sounds eerily familiar, that is because it is essentially the blueprint for Archie Bunker, word for word. Norman Lear saw the British show during a trip in England and immediately recognized what he was looking at. He saw the genius of using a bigoted character not to celebrate bigotry, but to expose it, to hold it up under the lights and let the audience see exactly how absurd and self-defeating it was, to make the bigot the butt of the joke rather than the hero of the story. It was a radical idea dressed up in comedy clothes, and Lear understood its power instantly. He came back to America and pitched the American version with one key adjustment. He moved the family from the streets of East London to the row houses of Queens, New York, a neighborhood that in the late 1960s and early 1970s was living through its own version of every cultural tension the show wanted to explore. White working-class families watching the neighborhood change around them, arguments at the dinner table about Vietnam, about civil rights, about who America was becoming and who got to decide. The translation was so perfect that Archie Bunker became more American than apple pie within 2 seasons. And yet the seed was planted in a BBC studio in London around a man who said, "Blimey," and drank his beer warm. The British original ran until 1975 and is still considered one of the most important and daring sitcoms in British television history. Both shows, separated by an ocean, were asking exactly the same question. What do you do with the love you feel for people whose views you find genuinely frightening? Both shows, remarkably, came up with almost the same answer. Number 10. Carroll O'Connor as Archie Bunker is one of those castings that feels, in retrospect, like it could not have gone any other way. The man lived inside that character. He found Archie's humanity underneath all the bluster and the bigotry in a way that made Archie simultaneously infuriating and, somehow, against all logic, oddly lovable. That combination is nearly impossible to execute, and O'Connor did it for 9 seasons without ever losing the thread, which is why it is a little dizzying to learn that Carroll O'Connor was not the first choice for the role. Before O'Connor was cast, Norman Lear had been in serious conversations with Mickey Rooney about playing Archie Bunker. Mickey Rooney, one of the most famous actors in Hollywood history, a man who had been a legitimate star since the 1930s, who had appeared in more than 300 films, who had enough name recognition to fill a stadium. By any conventional measure of the era, Rooney was a much bigger get than Carroll O'Connor. He had the comedic instincts, the energy, and the kind of presence that could dominate a room without raising his voice. The Rooney conversations did not progress for reasons that remain somewhat vague in the public record, and Lear eventually landed on O'Connor, at the time a solid, respected working actor with a good resume, but no real star power. What O'Connor brought to the role that you cannot teach and cannot manufacture was empathy. Even when Archie was saying something that made the audience cringe, O'Connor found the small, frightened man underneath the bluster, the man who was loud precisely because he was afraid, who was rigid because the world was changing too fast for him to process, who showed love badly and awkwardly, but showed it nonetheless. Carroll O'Connor won 4 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series for this performance.
And he became so completely identified with Archie Bunker that for the rest of his life, strangers would shout, "Stifle!" at him on the street, which is what Archie used to tell Edith when she was talking too much. Whether receiving that particular greeting from the public is flattering or exhausting probably depends on the day and the mood.
Number 9. Now here is a fact that is going to change the way you hear Edith Bunker's voice for the rest of your life. Jean Stapleton, the actress who played Edith, was making specific, deliberate, carefully considered choices about every single aspect of how that character came across, including and especially the voice. That voice. You know the one. High, slightly flat, warm, but somehow with the penetrating quality of a cheerful drill bit. The voice that could make Archie Bunker physically wince simply by entering a room while talking about nothing in particular. That voice was a craft decision, a strategy, a piece of deliberate theatrical engineering by a very smart woman who wanted you to underestimate her character. Jean Stapleton was in real life an educated, sophisticated, and entirely self-possessed person. She made a conscious choice to pitch Edith's voice in a way that would register as slightly grating, particularly to Archie, so that the audience would make the same mistake Archie always made, which was to dismiss Edith as simple. This is a technique acting coaches call playing against the text, meaning you use surface characteristics to conceal the deeper truth of a character, so that when the truth arrives, it hits the audience twice as hard because they were not expecting it. Edith Bunker was not a simple woman. She was patient, deeply intuitive, and morally clearer than almost everyone around her. She saw things that Archie could not see and said them in a way that landed like a gentle hammer. She carried the emotional heart of the whole show. And Stapleton spent 9 years quietly revealing this through the cracks of a character that most casual viewers were too busy underestimating to properly study. Jean Stapleton won 3 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series. Cheerfully, she was nominated twice more. The woman built one of the greatest performances in the history of American television inside a voice that could, under the right conditions, technically strip paint. That deserves enormous respect. Here is something I find genuinely wild. The majority of people watching this right now will not subscribe, not because they don't love it, but because they'll think they'll remember to come back. You just spent real time uncovering things about this show that most fans never knew. Subscribing is free, and it takes 2 seconds. Be the one who actually shows up and keeps classic TV history alive, one fact at a time. Hit subscribe right now, because the next fact is the one nobody ever talks about. Number 8. On January 12th, 1971, the night All in the Family premiered, something happened on American primetime television that had never happened before. An audience heard a toilet flush. That is the whole fact. And yes, before you move on, I need you to understand why that is not a throwaway detail, because the context makes it genuinely extraordinary. Before All in the Family, toilets did not exist on American television. Not the sound of them, not a mention of them, not even a suggestion that any of those warm, well-lit television homes had a bathroom with a function beyond occasional toothbrushing. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the government body that oversees broadcast media in the United States, had guidelines. The networks had standards and practices committees. The combined effect was a television universe in which all bodily functions had been silently and completely deleted from reality, as though everyone in the homes on your screen existed in a state of perpetual biological suspension. Playfully, Norman Lear found this not just ridiculous, but philosophically dishonest.
He was making a show about real people in a real house. Real people have toilets. Real toilets make sounds. Pretending otherwise was, in his view, exactly the kind of comfortable, sanitized dishonesty he had set out to dismantle. So in the very first episode, Archie and Edith come downstairs and, from the floor above, the audience hears, loudly, unmistakably, the sound of a toilet being flushed. The studio audience laughed for nearly 30 seconds. The CBS executives braced for outrage. They prepared for angry letters, for calls from affiliates, for the possibility of congressional attention. What they received instead was ratings. Remarkable, record-shattering ratings. 40 million viewers by the end of the first season. People across America were not horrified. They were relieved. Somebody on television was finally living in the same world they actually lived in, with the same plumbing and everything. Archie's chair and Edith's chair now live in the Smithsonian Institution, which is the United States National Collection of Museums. Think of it as the country's official attic of historically important things. The curators argued those chairs represented a specific and vital moment in American cultural history. The toilet flush, in its own peculiar way, was that moment's opening statement. Sometimes the most radical act is simply telling the truth about ordinary life. Number 7. Let me give you a list, because the sheer scope of it is what makes this particular fact so genuinely remarkable. In 9 seasons, All in the Family addressed the following subjects, all of which had essentially never been discussed on American primetime television before the show tackled them. Racism, not as an abstract concept, not as a faraway problem. Racism as it actually lived inside ordinary American households in the attitudes of people who considered themselves perfectly decent. Homosexuality. In 1971, on network television, Archie discovered that one of his oldest friends was gay. The episode did not treat this as a scandal to be resolved or a punchline to be milked. It treated it as a reality, complicated, human, and worthy of being shown. Menopause. Edith went through it on screen in real time with genuine emotional detail. This had never happened on American television before. Women watching reportedly called the network in tears, simply because they had never seen their experience reflected back at them on a sitcom. Rape. The show did a full episode in which Edith was nearly assaulted in her own home. It is widely considered one of the most powerful half hours in sitcom history. Gene Stapleton has spoken about the overwhelming volume of fan mail that episode generated. Impotence, meaning a man's inability to perform sexually, was discussed openly and with honesty. Miscarriage, breast cancer screening, the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, drug addiction, suicide. The show did not pick these topics up and wave them around for shock value. It did not use them as stunts to generate press and then retreat to safety. It engaged with every single one of them, with the same raw, sometimes uncomfortable honesty it brought to everything else. The reason this mattered so deeply comes down to something psychologists call the parasocial relationship, which is the complicated, very real emotional bond people form with television characters they watch regularly. When Edith went through menopause on screen, women watching felt genuinely seen, some for the first time in their lives, by anything on television. When Archie made a racist joke and the show held it up and let it be uncomfortable, people sitting at home who held the same views had to reckon with something they had never been asked to reckon with while eating their dinner in front of the TV. Art that makes people uncomfortable in a useful way is the rarest kind. All in the Family had it in almost every single episode for 9 years.
Number 6. Rob Reiner played Mike Stivic,
Archie's liberal, college-educated, passionately opinionated son-in-law, who Archie referred to as Meathead, with a consistency and conviction that suggested the nickname had been professionally registered. Mike was the ideological opposite of Archie in almost every imaginable way. Young, progressive, well-read, and absolutely certain that he was on the right side of every argument. He and Archie fought constantly, and with tremendous energy. And in a fact that probably wounded Mike's pride more than he ever admitted, Archie won more of those arguments than the smarter man technically should have. Rob Reiner was on the show from the very first episode in 1971 through 1978, when Mike and Gloria, Archie's daughter, packed up and left for California in what was a genuinely moving send-off. And then, Rob Reiner did something almost no one who has ever been called Meathead has managed to do. He built one of the most remarkable directorial careers in modern American film history. He directed Stand By Me in 1986, still considered one of the finest Stephen King adaptations ever committed to film, and one of the most honest, emotionally precise portraits of childhood friendship American cinema has ever produced. He directed This Is Spinal Tap in 1984, a mockumentary that not only invented an entire film genre, but continues to be quoted by people who have never even seen it, which is a particular kind of immortality. He directed The Princess Bride in 1987, a film so completely beloved that it has been continuously in print and continuously quoted across nearly 4 decades, and shows no signs of stopping. He directed When Harry Met Sally in 1989, which gave the world the "I'll have what she's having" moment, still one of the most recognized scenes in the history of romantic comedy. He directed A Few Good Men in 1992, which gave the world "You Can't Handle the Truth," delivered by Jack Nicholson with enough force to register on seismographs. 5 of the most beloved films of the 1980s and early 1990s. 5 films that are still watched, still quoted, still taught in film schools. All from the man Archie Bunker called Meathead. All from the same person who spent 7 years losing arguments at the Bunker dinner table. There is a version of the story where the greatest tribute All in the Family ever received was not the Emmy Awards. It was not the ratings. It was what the man who left it went on to build. Number 5. In 1978, the Smithsonian Institution officially accepted 2 pieces of furniture from the set of All in the Family: Archie's chair and Edith's chair. 2 armchairs from a television set, sitting in one of the most prestigious historical collections in the world, alongside, among other things, the original Star-Spangled Banner, Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, and Julia Child's actual kitchen. Now, I want you to genuinely sit with that for a moment, because it is either deeply profound or deeply funny. And honestly, it might be both at the same time, which is exactly the kind of thing All in the Family would have appreciated. The reasoning behind the acquisition, the decision to preserve them permanently, was serious and thoroughly considered. The Smithsonian's curators made the argument that All in the Family had documented a specific and important inflection point in American social history. They argued that those 2 chairs, placed side by side in that living room, had functioned as a visual shorthand for everything the show was about. The generational divide, the class divide, the ideological chasm between an America that wanted to hold on and an America that was pushing forward whether anyone liked it or not. Archie's chair in particular had become a cultural symbol entirely on its own. He sat in it like a man who believed he held the chair by divine right, with absolute certainty that it was his, that it had always been his, and that nobody else could possibly be worthy of it. The chair became the physical embodiment of his entire philosophy of life. The fact that this chair now sits behind glass in a museum, being analyzed by cultural historians, looked at by visitors from around the world, while Archie himself would have found the whole idea ridiculous, and probably also somehow communist, is a kind of perfect irony that the show itself would have served up with a straight face and a laugh track. You can visit them. They are still there. You can stand in front of Archie Bunker's chair in the Smithsonian Institution and think about what it meant, and what, arguably, it still means. That is a genuinely remarkable thing for two armchairs to have accomplished.
Number 4. Here is a fact that sits in a very specific category of television history. All in the Family won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series 4 consecutive years in a row, from 1971 through 1975. At the time, that was the longest consecutive winning streak in the award's history. It has since been matched and surpassed, but for a long time, All in the Family held that record outright, in a way that felt less like an award and more like the industry repeatedly stopping to say, "We keep watching everything else, and nothing else is doing what this show is doing." What makes those wins more impressive is who the competition was. All in the Family was not winning by default in a weak era. It was consistently beating MASH, one of the most acclaimed dramas disguised as comedies in the history of American television. It was beating The Mary Tyler Moore Show, a genuinely excellent and groundbreaking program with fierce critical and audience support. These were real programs, well-made, beloved, and the industry kept voting for the show about the loud man in the chair anyway. The reason, drawn from interviews and commentary by Emmy voters from that period, was almost always the same. All in the Family was doing something that nothing else on television was doing. It was using comedy to say things that drama was too polished and too careful to say. It was making audiences laugh and squirm and think, sometimes within the same 30 seconds of the same scene. That specific combination, genuine comedy and genuine social weight running at full voltage simultaneously, is one of the hardest things to execute in all of storytelling. Resigned, most shows that carry a message become too preachy to be funny. Most comedies that chase laughs sacrifice meaning to get there. All in the Family ran both at the same time, at full power, for 9 seasons, in a way that felt less like an award and more like the industry repeatedly stopping to say, this was something genuinely different. 4 consecutive Emmys is the television industry's formal way of acknowledging that it watched a lot of television, and this was something genuinely different.
Real quick, if you're finding out things about All in the Family that genuinely surprised you, you're exactly who this channel was built for. One click on that subscribe button means you never miss another deep dive into the shows that built everything. Think of it as giving classic TV the respect it actually deserves, because nobody else is doing it quite like this. Hit subscribe, and let's keep going.
Number 3. Norman Lear, the man who created All in the Family, who fought for it through 2 network rejections, who refined it and convinced CBS to bet on it, spent significant portions of the show's run receiving hate mail and death threats. Not because the show failed, because it succeeded spectacularly. The threats came from multiple directions simultaneously, which tells you something important about what the show was actually doing. They came from conservative groups who believed the show was a liberal propaganda piece designed to mock working-class American values. They came from liberal groups who worried the show's portrayal of Archie might inadvertently normalize the very attitudes it was trying to expose. They came from white supremacist organizations, actual organized hate groups who felt the show was an attack on their worldview. And they came from civil rights advocates who, at various moments during the show's run, raised legitimate questions about whether comedy was even the right tool for confronting racism, or whether it gave people a way to laugh at something they should be made uncomfortable by. When the opposing extremes are both furious with you at the same time, you have almost certainly found the actual center of something genuinely important. It is very hard to upset everyone simultaneously. It usually requires that you have said something true that nobody on either side wants to hear. Lear has spoken in interviews about receiving the death threats and deciding, after careful consideration, that they were confirmation rather than deterrent. That if nobody was upset, the show was probably not saying anything worth the trouble of making. He kept making the show. He also, in the same period, created The Jeffersons, Maude, Good Times, and One Day at a Time, essentially building an entire alternative television universe of shows, each in its own way pressing on the same bruises All in the Family had found. Norman Lear was still working and giving interviews into his late 90s. He passed away in December 2023 at the age of 101 years old. 101. Working until the very end. At that age, most people have graduated to yelling at their own television, not making the programs on it. If there is a person in the history of American entertainment who did more to expand what was allowed to be said in your living room on a Wednesday night, I have not encountered them yet.
Number 2. All in the Family did not just change television. It built an entire television ecosystem around itself. The show directly spawned 4 major spin-offs, each of which ran for multiple seasons and became a significant program in its own right. A creative legacy that almost no other sitcom in the history of American television has come close to matching. The Jeffersons followed Archie and Edith's neighbors, George and Louise Jefferson, after they moved from Queens to a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It ran for 11 seasons, from 1975 to 1985. George Jefferson, played by Sherman Hemsley with a swagger that could fill a stadium, became one of the most iconic characters in the history of American sitcom. The show also featured one of the first regularly appearing interracial couples in American network television history, a choice that in 1975 took real courage from everyone involved. Maude followed Archie's outspoken, thoroughly progressive cousin, Maude Findlay, played by the incomparable Bea Arthur. It ran for 6 seasons and is remembered, among other things, for a 1972 two-part episode in which Maude had an abortion in 1972 on prime-time network television. Norman Lear received death threats for that one, too. At this point, the death threats were practically becoming a tradition. Good Times was technically a spin-off of Maude rather than All in the Family directly, but it lived in the same creative universe and arrived at the same address. Cheerfully, it followed a black family living in a Chicago housing project, ran for 6 seasons, and introduced the world to J.J. Evans and the phrase, "Dynamite!" which for anyone who grew up in a certain era requires no further explanation whatsoever. Archie Bunker's Place was the direct continuation of All in the Family after Gene Stapleton left the show. It ran for 4 additional seasons, taking Archie's story forward in a way that, as you will see in a moment, was considerably more emotionally complicated than anyone anticipated. 4 major spin-offs, a combined run of approximately 26 more seasons of television, enough content to fill an extremely long holiday weekend of watching and still have enough left over for Tuesday. Intense. No single American sitcom of the 1970s generated anything like that kind of creative legacy. And all of it, every bit of it, traces directly back to Norman Lear's original idea about a loud, stubborn, deeply imperfect man from Queens, sitting in a chair he considered entirely his own.
Number 1. Here is the one that still lands differently every time I tell it. By 1980, All in the Family had transitioned into a new show called Archie Bunker's Place. Gene Stapleton had made the decision that her time as Edith was finished. She felt she had explored everything there was to explore in the character, and she communicated clearly to the producers that she would not be returning for a proper farewell episode. The producers had a decision to make. How do you close the chapter on Edith Bunker, one of the most beloved characters in American television history, without the actress who played her willing to come back for a send-off?
They made a choice that was either deeply pragmatic or quietly devastating, depending on how much you loved Edith. And I suspect most of you loved her quite a bit. Edith Bunker died of a stroke, off-screen, between seasons. There was no goodbye scene, no hospital room, no final moment between Archie and the woman he had spent 30 years arguing with and loving in his complicated, frequently inarticulate way. There was no bedtime speech, no last look, nothing that gave the audience a formal moment to say goodbye. Archie came home, Edith was simply gone. And the world had changed in the way that the world changes when the person who held the center of it is no longer there, not with a dramatic announcement, but with an absence that reshapes everything around it. In the season premiere, while Archie was cleaning the bedroom, he found Edith's slipper under the bed. He picked it up, he looked at it, and Carol O'Connor, in what many television historians and critics consider the single finest moment of his career, let the grief come. Not the performed, theatrical grief where a character cries in a way that reads clearly from the back of the room, the quiet, private, slightly confused grief of a man who does not quite know what to do with what he is holding in his hands. The audience across America apparently did not know what to do with it either. CBS received an extraordinary volume of letters and calls after that episode aired. The remarkable thing about those letters was that a great many of them were written not by fans of the show, but by people who had lost a spouse, people who recognized that moment not as a television moment, but as a real one. People who had been in that same room, holding something small that belonged to someone who was no longer there, trying to figure out what comes next. Jean Stapleton later said she believed the decision was right. She thought Edith's absence being felt more powerfully than her death being shown was entirely in keeping with who Edith was, a woman whose presence was so quietly, completely irreplaceable that the shape of every room she had ever been in changed permanently when she left it. Archie Bunker, the man who had told her to stifle it 1,000 times, who had spent 30 years struggling to say out loud what she already knew he meant, held her slipper and completely fell apart. That is the whole show. 9 seasons of it, right there, in one moment.
12 facts about one of the most important and most fearless television programs ever made. And honestly, even now, we have barely scratched the surface. All in the Family is the kind of show that keeps revealing new layers every time you come back to it. There is always something else underneath. Speaking of shows that deserve a closer look, our next video goes deep into the cast of Saved by the Bell and where they all ended up. And before you say, I already know this one, I promise you, you do not know the full Dustin Diamond chapter. Screech Powers. What happened to that man? Is something no Saved by the Bell fan saw coming. And once you know it, you genuinely cannot unknow it. That video is right there. Click it.